Alrighty, so we're in Matthew 8, verses 1 through 17 today. Go ahead and give that a read and come back afterwards. Alright, so Jesus has just delivered the Sermon on the Mount, and now he's coming off of the mountainside, and he's about to begin to work some miracles of healing for quite a few people. And the very first one is really one of my favorites because of just a small detail in the story, and that's why it's so important for us to study the Bible, because we oftentimes skip over these small details. It's not something I noticed until probably a year ago or so. And so this first person is a man with leprosy. And now back in Bible days, leprosy was kind of a long and slow and painful death sentence. You see, it was this disease or this infection, and it would cause nerve damage, and it would cause these lesions and these pustules to form all over your skin, and it would eventually cause you to go blind, and just all of these other painful problems it would cause. And even more so than this, it would spread through contact. So it could be spread through the air, it could be spread through touching of the skin, and because of that, the lepers, they were cast out of society, and they would have to live in these camps on the outskirts of the cities. And so these people, these lepers, they would have to rely on people to bring them scraps of food, or they would starve to death. They had to live away from the city. They couldn't come to the temple anymore. And even more so, they couldn't be around people anymore. They couldn't be touched by their family members if they were married. They couldn't be touched by their spouse anymore. I mean, it really was a sentence to death, both physically and socially. And even if they were around people for whatever reason, they were supposed to ring a bell and shout out, "Unclean, unclean," and all the Jewish people, they knew you were supposed to stay a certain distance away from a leper. And so I tell you all this to say, as bad as the disease was physically, it was obviously horrible emotionally, and it would just devastate you socially, because you lost touch with humanity, essentially. These people, they were considered an unclean outcast, and they would basically be unable to feel the touch of another human being for the rest of their life. And that oftentimes wasn't but a few months or a few years at most. But on this day, this particular leper happened to meet the Savior. And, I would imagine he had heard the stories of what Jesus had done in other towns. He heard the stories of healing, and he was probably hoping, or probably even praying, that those stories were true. And so he asked Jesus, he said, "Lord, if you're willing, I know you can make me clean." And what Jesus does next probably made the people around him gasp in fear and amazement. Because Jesus, he reaches out and he touches this leper. This is not something you do, but Jesus does it in order to heal him. Now, as we think about that, and here's the little detail, that touch is the little detail. Could Jesus have healed this leper without touching him? Well, he absolutely could have. Jesus is part of the Godhead, is part of the Trinity. It was his words that spoke the universe into existence. Jesus could have healed this man with just his words. But this man needed more than just physical healing. He needed spiritual and emotional healing too. And so Jesus reaches out, and what was likely the first touch this man has received in many months or years, and as Jesus touches him, for the first time, this leper, he feels the warmth of another human embracing him. And as he feels the loving hand of Christ touching him, he also would be beginning to feel the pain from his condition go numb. And the sores on his body would begin closing up and healing, and maybe his vision was sharpening, and within moments he would realize that he was completely healed. And just imagine the joy and the emotions and the overwhelming emotions that were flooding this man's mind at the time as he realized he was healed. And I just think it's so cool. I mean, how cool is that? And what a loving Savior we have. Jesus knew exactly what this man needed. He needed that touch that only Jesus could provide. And just think it's awesome. And so the account moves on. It tells us about the faith of the centurion, and it once again affirms that Jesus totally could have healed the leper, and so that adds just even more credence to that interpretation of the passage, that Jesus intentionally touched the leper here because it was something that the leper needed. But it tells of the faith of the centurion, and it affirms that those who knew who Christ was, they put great faith in them. And it once again affirms that faith is what heals, faith is what saves, and faith is what is rewarded. And then finally, in verses 14 through 17, we see even more examples of Jesus just healing people and freeing them. And it tells us, Matthew tells us, that this once again is foretold by the prophets. Remember, this has been a theme in Matthew, telling that it was foretold by the prophets, and it gives us the verse references even, or he quotes from the Old Testament. And this is just Matthew's way of once again affirming over and over again, building an irrefutable case that Jesus is the promised Messiah, that the Son of God who would come to take away the sins of the world. And as I read these passages, it just makes me love Jesus more. I mean, Jesus could have come and he could have only been on earth 2 or 3 days. He could have shown up in some grandiose fashion, lights and fireworks and angels singing praises to him as he comes down, and he could have just given one short message of, oh, if you want to be saved, put your faith in me. Then he could have disappeared back to heaven, never to be seen from again. That's not what he did. He came and he was born like us, and he grew like us, and he lived like us, so that he could experience all the things that we could experience, and so that he could provide a role model for us. And then, he lived that life that we couldn't live, the one of being perfect, of the perfect obedience to the Father. And he died the death that we deserved so that we could be saved. And so he spent those years of his ministry showing abounding love to his children time and time again. And man, doesn't it make you love him even more? So that was my takeaway from it today.